Welcome to Perspectives with Asima Silva. We have a returning guest today, Dr. Bill Slaughter. We have had him talk about many interesting topics, especially when it comes to mental health, trauma, specifically in Palestine and Gaza Strip. Today, we actually have another interesting topic, and it's very time relevant. After the George Floyd incident, most of our country is talking about, police training, police brutality, the type of conduct that the police are using to maybe, hold down a particular person.
As usual, Asima, thanks so much. You have such a great platform here for talking about really important issues. Been involved with U.S. and Palestine-Israel issues for some time, kind of in healthcare, but in more general advocacy, since general social well-being underpins healthcare for everybody and wellness for everybody. So I did want to talk a little bit about some of the police connections between the U.S. and the kind of the superstructure over in the Israel-Palestine area. I think a critical thing to acknowledge, though, is just that we in the U.S. have our problems and have for centuries since we've been around. I think it's really important to say that while some of what we're talking about does have to do with interaction between the two areas, we're not trying to blame this on anybody. In fact, there's a lot of reciprocal influence from the U.S. to that area and that area to the U.S. and so on. Anyway, basic topic is just talking about since 9/11, there's been a movement towards a lot of U.S. police trainings by trips to Palestine-Israel area for police training over there, and also the Israeli government doing trainings here in the U.S. or related groups for police officers around the U.S. I think like I said, both areas have their own history. One way I think about how the areas are similar is just an overall social ideology. Now, U.S. has a long history of this idea of manifest destiny. That was the idea when we were on the East Coast of looking west and seeing that big continental expanse to the Pacific and saying that there's God-given destiny for the U.S. to roll out across that area. Oftentimes Israeli society and Israeli state are compared to the U.S. They're said to have a tight relationship, and we do in a lot of ways. Of course, over there's the idea, too, that the group that's currently dominant has special rights and special relationship with God in a quite similar way. So kind of that's some general sociology underpinning kind of both groups. So generally, these trainings, there's about 4 different groups, my understanding is, in the U.S. that helps facilitate these. Let me pause there and say, there's this idea of if you don't know about it, don't talk about it. There's also an idea, well, we're our brothers' keepers and sisters' keepers. We're all participating in society. This is an example of a topic that I'm not a real expert in, but I feel like I have intermediate area expertise, and this was kind of a platform that didn't have information about this, so that's why I wanted to talk about it. Usually there's groups of maybe 1 to 2 dozen officers and other law enforcement and criminal justice related folks, prosecutors and so on, who take maybe 5 or 10 day kind of trips over to Israel-Palestine. And they'll have different trainings that typically have to do with different topics. The main framing is given that these are learning from an experienced system that knows a lot about terrorism, okay? So, and that's certainly has some truth to it, and that's certainly a concern after 9/11. I myself worked in a jail as a mental health worker. I was in the Army. Terrorism, meaning immediate kind of deadly violence, unsanctioned by any real social group, it's a bad thing. It's just that word can be used in so many ways. I'm from Washington State. I was sad to see when I looked at a U.S. Lynching database that there have been lynchings in my home state, a few, less than in other parts of the United States. It's common these days to talk about where are we and whose land was this for Native American folks. I don't know Massachusetts people very much, but I looked here, in Worcester, and I see Massachusetts people or Mohegan people. I grew up in the land of people out in the Puget Sound area called the Puyallup tribe. And just in working with them in different ways, occasionally came to learn their experience of the takeover. And their experience is that they went through some terror attacks by a group called the US government and white settlers and that. I had one woman, elder, one time just tear up in front of me, flashing back to being about 8 years old when she was in what they call the Fife Indian School outside Seattle, Tacoma, locked in a closet for speaking her language, Lushootseed. There's massacres, a famous one, Mashel Massacre by the old Mount Rainier, if any of you have seen that, by white forces just killing probably about 30 unarmed Native folks and stuff like that. So terrorism, who is it, who gets to label all that? But there's real issues there. One of the main things that police reporting back talk about is crowd control, right? So when I think here in the US of kind of terrorism in different ways, I don't think of kind of crowd control. I usually think of small groups, white nationalists in Michigan blew up Oklahoma courthouse and other groups. But crowd control is a bigger kind of thing. Now, in Israel-Palestine, about a quarter of the area is under direct military occupation, the West Bank area. So there's no real civilian policing there. It's just flat out military. Any kind of protest and any gathering, I think it's over 10 people, is illegal without a permit. Any kind of protest is automatically criminal and often labeled terrorist. So when you think of population control or crowd control, that's in context. What folks are being trained in context is in a system that has two separate court systems for Palestinians, a military court system, civilian court system for most Jewish people and a few Israeli Palestinians as well, and a whole structure that's built on ethnic differences. It's an ethnic privilege, ethnic separation structure. So when our police are being trained into crowd control as a part of terrorism, you can see there's a real kind of overlap there of just crowds of people who are protesting sometimes peacefully, like we want to have, our Constitution and Bill of Rights, as already being part of the picture. So of course that influences people in any way, and coming back here and starting to think of crowd control and that as maybe being connected to terrorism. There's also color divide, darn well, the color divisions here, they're such a big part of the challenge. So that's just kind of like one of the root concerns there about the whole context that happens in.
I never would have thought the words crowd control being used in that manner. I mean, that shows the kind of environment I grew up in. For me, crowd controlled, I immediately associate a concert.
Exactly.
Or a baseball
Exactly.
game or a football game. I'm not thinking protest as crowd control.
I think of ushers, things do get rowdy sometimes.
Right.
I think of civilian police maybe, and that kind of thing. But just that joining of terrorism and crowd control is kind of indicative of the context and concerns. So some of the other aspects is, well, what do these trainings consist of? And I'll say that one of my challenges is it's hard to get information about some of this material. And I have been able to get some people know more than I do and all that. But some of the things that apparently police are trained in, racial profiling is a big part of it. And obviously that's been really controversial here, but again, that whole system of control now, the state structure in Israel-Palestine is a profiling system. That's the core of it.
One
It
is
always
based
has been.
ethnically, one is based racially.
Well, over there, it's basically the two main people, the Jewish people and people who are Palestinian Arab, have quite clear legal distinctions and privileges.
Right.
Now, in each population, there's a color spectrum. In the Jewish population, from more Mediterranean and Arab people who are Jewish to more white, Ashkenazi, European. In Palestinian population, there are some people whose skin is entirely white and some who are entirely black. So there's colorism through the whole groups, but that's not the distinction. The distinction is a religious distinction.
Right.
So that's the main distinction there. And one of the challenges in the US is that with our history of trying to move towards all created equal, with a long ways to go, is that we might downplay in some way, well, you know, you're Jew, you're Christian, maybe you're Muslim, as I know, but over there, those distinctions are written into law.
Right.
Many laws are written into every ID card. They're written into every level, almost every level of privilege. So that profiling is very thoroughgoing over there, and that's what that's the system that our folks are being entrained into. An example of that is the main airport over there at Lud Ben Gurion Airport. Has for a long time been a real center for the Israeli state. Kind of developing more profiling techniques and safety techniques and so on. After 9/11, apparently Logan Airport here in Massachusetts adopted a model pretty soon afterwards that was based on what the Israeli state had put together. It had to do with behavioral analysis, looking for people who are sweating or late for a plane or dressed inappropriately, I think was one of the indicators. All these kind of things, although there's a lot of evidence, concern from even our own Congress, the General Accounting Office and the American Civil Liberties Union, about these kind of methodologies not having much evidence to them. The incident I had going to that airport, I've been in and out of there many times, driving myself with friends, friends who were Jewish, cab drivers and all the time. The only time I drove into that airport with a Palestinian in the car was the only time that the car was pulled aside immediately on the outer periphery of the airport, and then you get special treatment. Now the guy who was driving me later told me that the treatment we got was kid glove, because there was a privileged white guy in the car with a blue US passport. But we got all the being separated, mirrors under the car, examining everything, all that. He said if he had been alone or with other Arabs, things would have been quite different. Surveillance. Think of surveillance kind of in two main areas, electronic and then human kind of surveillance. The whole area over there in Israel-Palestine has a lot of very tight individual identification. Identification cards have a lot of information on them. There's a development of a biometric system for almost all Israelis. Facial recognition, that's a world center of developing a lot of facial recognition and other technologies like that. The camera system over there is quite developed. This is an example of techniques from over there coming to the US. In the old city of Jerusalem, now this is where the church where Jesus was crucified and buried. This is the Western Wall for the Jewish folks. This is Al-Aqsa, Masjid Al-Aqsa for Muslim folks, where Muhammad went up to meet with God. That area, I think of as a tourist area and also a very meaningful religious area. I'm touched when I'm there. But there are a lot of control cameras around there. If you visit there, you'll see the military patrols that are going through there all the time, little squads of Israeli army with their heavy armor and guns and stuff like that in there. But behind that, the network of cameras you can't see, or at least I couldn't see. So apparently there's about 400 cameras observing and controlling that part of the occupied Jerusalem. One of the participants talked about his tour, seeing the command center there, where all the videos displayed and all that. And he just says in kind of gushing language, seemed like Star Wars. You could follow anybody through the whole city and things like that. That control center was cited by a former police officer, police chief, of Atlanta, as his model for setting up apparently a widespread camera system in downtown Atlanta, that kind of thing. So that's one kind of surveillance that's quite strong there. The Star Wars comment makes me think about the general tone of what people returning from the trips are quoted as saying. There's a lot of information about this in local newspapers, reporting on, our police came back from a trip, that kind of thing. And also a lot of the Israeli papers. I can only read the ones in English, but Jerusalem Post and Israel Times and Haaretz, newspapers like that. The officers will often give quite gushing, fawning kind of comments just kind of idealizing the system over there. Sometimes there's one quote about two civilized nations having common enemies. And that's back to me, that harkens back to this special connection with God. Other people are lower, they don't have that connection, that kind of ethic. And a lot of quotes about what they experienced serving as a good model for them coming back to the US. That tone is there a lot. I'll pause there for a minute.
Well, I do have a couple questions on a couple of the things you mentioned. You talked about surveillance, and surveillance can be good and bad.
Yep.
So I see that as something concerning, but since we haven't seen it like as to the extent as you had mentioned in the area that people came back saying it looked like Star Wars, I feel that why should we be concerned about that? What parts of the similarities that you're talking about should we be concerned about? Because with surveillance and some of the points you made, identifying people after 9/11 at Logan, seems to me as a precautionary step. I think after a certain amount of time, when people have decided, okay, we are safe now, we have, implemented X, Y, and Z to make our country safer, maybe we don't need all those measures. For example, ever since, there was a lot of terrorist attacks in places of worship in the last year, in 2019. Many places of worship invited people to give them advice on how to identify suspicious people who might come to their congregation or to their worship. So it seems very similar to me on how maybe Logan Airport would want some advice on how to set up their airport to make it safer. When should we be concerned? Because some of these points almost seems like something we as citizens expect and want our government to do.
Yeah. Well, it's a critical and big question. There's 8 billion of us on the earth now. We had tremendous democratization of access to a lot of technologies, including weapons. Here the U.S. is awash in arms, and just instructions for bombs apparently are available over the internet and things like that. I think of the Tree of Life temple and others. I think of the masjid in New Zealand and that. So certainly it's critical. I'll just say what many people do. I don't think there's easy answers, but I think one of the most important things is to keep having this kind of discussion. One of the challenges is that, well, there's a question of, the old question of civil liberties and privacy versus safety in that, and where do we stand? We have to keep talking about that. A challenge with being trained into the system over there is that there's not many privacy, certainly for Palestinians, there are just about zero privacy and rights there's not much discussion at all of that question. There are arrests without warrants. There are searches in the middle of the night that don't need probable cause. This is military and on the other parts of the area, some of the police actions. There's detention without due process, so without our habeas corpus, or needing to show where a person is and acknowledge that. It just really mass surveillance. So what degree of intrusion and all that should there be?
Right.
Again, I don't mean to say that there's easy answers. I myself am glad that there is ability within the U.S. to have some authority, some muscle sometimes. I've been involved with scary incidents when I've been a mental health worker in the community. I've been involved with some scary incidents, including involving officers in the jails and stuff like that. It's just that who controls those, how much of an open discussion do we have? There have been some successes kind of with more open acknowledgement and discussion of this particular training mechanism. One that's coming up now that I'm thinking of with us right here having a discussion was just last year in Atlanta. Apparently Mayor Bottoms, who's had the more national exposure now, when she was running, said that she would put a hold on Atlanta police training in that kind of big racial profile structure, if you will, that is Israel over there, when she was elected. And so after that, I'm sure she was quite busy. That didn't kind of go forward yet. So a community coalition of 67 different community groups sent her a letter. It didn't say, stop it. It said, let's have a real overt and open community discussion about that. So I think that approach is really important.
Right.
One of the most exciting things about that letter, when I read through the signatory groups, was that the folks of the three Abrahamic traditions, there were Jewish groups, there were Muslim groups, there were Christian groups, all there together, all saying, let's talk about it. All of our safety is important, equality is important, and that kind of thing. And that just, always touches my heart. I've been involved with some, I say cross-Abrahamic delegation advocating for equality in Israel-Palestine with our senator's offices down in DC, and it's always easier to schedule. There's always good reception when it's a mixture of Jewish background,
Right.
Muslim background, Christian folk. So I think that idea of open discussion is really important.
So the trainings you're describing is, facilities training, surveillance training, and like when going back to originally with the George Floyd incident, how is it also training on how to subdue a potential person of threat?
Yes. Again, the exact training manual and that kind of thing, I've not had access to that, so I can't tell you exactly. But I do know that some of the reports of the training talk about officers being at crowd control situations, in other words, with the Israeli police or military, when there's a demonstration or something like that going on, and seeing how the actual tactics are done. A related part of that and that typically involves real strong force. That involves clubs, it involves rubber bullets, metal bullets that are rubber coated. It involves certainly tear gas. It involves a vile liquid called skunk, which is a kind of thick, very foul-smelling liquid that's just sprayed all over whole neighborhoods in Israel-Palestine when there's protests going on sometimes. Partly to label who's been there. Apparently some of the versions have colorant to it, I understand. And when people leave the area, you can see who was sprayed. But also it's just impossible to get off for some days. So it's a kind of group punishment as well.
Because it's very hard for me to really comprehend why you would want to punish a group of people. And I can see sometimes if it's out of control and for overall safety, maybe it has to be used. I'm not going to say that I don't think these kind of techniques will ever be, will never have to be used. I'm sure there's incidents where it warrants it. But being into the mental health profession, what effect does this have on people?
Well, I could be psychological and say, give me your thoughts on that. Do you want to say a little bit? I have a lot of experience and thoughts on that.
I'm just assuming that, like you said, if it's a protest and if it's a crowd, it's supposed to, I'm imagining, play with the person's motivation to ever want to stand up and to kind of scare them into submission.
Absolutely.
Instead of I can understand a lot of people might be okay with this kind of technique if it was used in a situation where, for the greater good, in the sense of most people might get hurt in some way, shape, or form, is when it is used. But if it is used as blatantly or like as openly as you had mentioned, it could to the Palestinians. I'm a little afraid of those kind of trainings being done to our police officers and our law enforcement, because those techniques can also be used here when necessary, but are we also training them based on certain different values? Because if we're not, then that's concerning to me.
Well, remember, a big part of that system is not much of a distinction between military and police and then covert surveillance and control mechanisms. My son Isaac's out in Portland now. I talked to him 2 nights ago. He talks about just the escalation. He lives quite near downtown. He can see downtown where there's challenges going on there. Now there's helicopters every night after 5 o'clock, and you can hear explosions and so on going down. So going on there in the evenings. That's an example of escalation, just flat out militarized federal agents that do have a role there. Now, the Mark Hatfield federal office in Portland that I'm aware of, I used to go to school right there in the neighborhood, that should have protection in my view. that should not involve broader provocation and so on against civilian desire to not have it locally. So that's an example of kind of this pushing militarization in provocative kind of ways. Now, psychologically, what does that do? You're exactly right on, and that's an example of, when we ask questions, we probably know the answer in some ways. So yeah,
I guess I was hoping I'm wrong.
Well, I don't think you are. Sorry about that. That psychology of me, myself, being beaten down, arrested for a year, et cetera, that kind of thing, or seeing that happen ongoingly for decades now in Palestine, and we'll say it's still in the U.S. This is not, an Israeli state problem. This is a U.S. problem here.
Right.
We influence each other. That is part of the problem, but our root problem is here. So just for hundreds of years here, what has that done? It's hurt all of us. There was a German philosopher, Hegel, who talked about a master-slave relationship. Everybody knows that being one down in a power relationship is bad. Part of what he talked about is how people in the supposedly dominant, in ways that are dominant in very clear ways, are warped psychologically. That's part of the situation too. I don't know if you've seen some of the black and white pictures from 1960s in Alabama with some of the just distorted white hatred faces that are there. That's what happens to us. So anyway, what happens like that? Yes, certainly people get discouraged over time. And it's the specific use of force like that, repeatedly, consistently, predictably. It's also broader control or influence of the narrative. One of the other things that U.S. police and other law enforcement talk about is being trained into how to use the media as part of the whole package. The Israeli kind of control structure has a very strong censorship, censorship system. In one recent counting year, about 270 articles, over 270 articles were nixed from publication by the censors there, by media there. And over 20%, I think it was, of other articles had extensive, some redaction or censorship inside. And that reaches over to the US. The New York Times reported that one of its reporters was acquiesced to that system there. So there's the thought of how do we frame everything? What do we get out? What do we let out? How do we frame this crowd control as terrorism? And we can see that with the current administration ramping up to elections now, trying to demonize peaceful protesters led by, thank God, Black Lives Matter now, trying to get some social momentum going and getting that going wonderfully, and then trying to demonize with actions, destructive actions of a few people. So exactly that kind of thing is exactly what goes on, and that's quite tragic. I remember back when I was a boy, nightly news reports from Vietnam, gritty black and white pictures on the three big networks of just our older brothers and sisters over there, just in firefights and just carnage. Now, in the decades since, external to the U.S., we've had this embedding of media, with the armed forces. So just watering down of what we get. Seeing those pictures for, years, every night about Vietnam was a big part of us changing our policy there. And there's a lot of racial issues there as well, with Americans of color doing a lot of the fighting of people of color as well. So that ingrained kind of control structure, one of the things that helped break that down was just flat out showing people what was happening. Right. And that's similar to us just talking about, yes, we need safety. Right. Yes, there are scary things that happen. How far does it go? In what context? How do we do that? That kind of thing.
So we are over time, and thank you for joining us, but I'm going to invite Dr. Bill Slaughter to talk about this further because I don't think we're finished with the discussion. But what you learned today, or at least I learned today, was crowd control and terrorism, the definition, who labels it when, depending upon the situation. And a lot of things to think about in terms of police training. Of course, we need the police, we need law enforcement, but what does it mean about the trainings? Does it come with any other times where when to use this kind of training and when not to? Those are the questions we should start thinking about, and we'll have more conversations on this topic. Thank you for joining us today, and hope you join me again with Perspectives with Asima Silva.